In the rugged Montana territory of 1878, where the vast prairies stretched endlessly toward distant mountains, Clara Whitfield appeared to be exactly what passing travelers expected to see: a lone settler's wife tending her modest homestead, while her husband worked the distant silver mines. What the three-horse thieves watching from the ridgeline couldn't possibly know was that beneath her calico dress and sunbonnet lived skills learned during 15 years among the Blackfoot Nation, where she had been taught to track, hunt, and fight with a precision that would make seasoned warriors proud. They saw vulnerability where deadly capability waited in silence. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Clearwater Valley. As Clara Whitfield stepped onto the wooden porch of her log cabin, a steaming cup of coffee warming her hands against the crisp September air. At 32, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to solitude, her auburn hair braided practically down her back, her simple blue calico dress complemented by sturdy leather boots that spoke of functionality over fashion. The homestead that surrounded her was modest but well-maintained, a sturdy cabin built from lodgepole pine, a small barn housing their precious livestock, and fields of winter wheat that were golden in the early autumn light. To any observer, Clara presented the picture of a typical frontier wife managing her household while waiting for her husband's return from the mining camps near Helena. She moved with purposeful efficiency, checking the chicken coop where a dozen hens scratched contentedly in their enclosed run, examining the vegetable garden that provided most of their sustenance through the harsh Montana winters, and ensuring the split-rail fence surrounding their small pasture remained secure against the wandering elk and occasional bear that frequented the valley. What those casual observers couldn't see were the subtle details that marked Clara as something far more formidable than appearances suggested. The way her eyes constantly scanned the horizon, not with the anxious worry of an isolated woman, but with the systematic alertness of someone trained in survival. The manner in which she positioned herself near cover whenever she worked outdoors, never standing exposed in open ground for extended periods. Most telling of all was her unconscious habit of listening to the rhythm of bird calls and wind patterns, reading the natural world with an intimacy that few white settlers ever achieved. 3 miles away, hidden among the dense pine forest that crowned the eastern ridge overlooking the valley, Silas Crenshaw lowered his field glasses and smiled with the cold satisfaction of a predator who had found easy prey. At 45, Crenshaw had spent the better part of 2 decades stealing horses across the frontier territories, developing an eye for opportunity and weakness that had kept him alive and prosperous in a dangerous profession. His weathered face bore the scars of previous encounters that hadn't gone entirely according to plan, but his calculating gray eyes held the confidence of a man who had successfully evaluated countless targets. "Well, boys," he said quietly to his 2 companions, "looks like we found ourselves a perfect setup. One woman, all alone, with what appears to be prime horseflesh just waiting for new owners." Beside him, Jake Morrison nodded eagerly while adjusting the worn leather holster at his hip. At 28, Morrison possessed the restless energy of a man perpetually seeking his next score, his dark hair hanging in greasy strands beneath a battered hat that had seen better decades. His clothes, once fine enough to suggest a more respectable past, now bore the stains and tears of life on the wrong side of frontier law. Morrison had joined Crenshaw's gang 6 months earlier after a disastrous attempt at robbing a stagecoach. Near Billings had left him desperate for both money and protection. "Looks like her man's away at the mines," Morrison observed, spitting tobacco juice into the pine needles at his feet. "Can't see hide nor hair of anyone else around that place. Just her and whatever livestock she's got penned up." The third member of their group, Tommy Berkshire, shifted uncomfortably on his haunches as he studied the peaceful homestead below. At barely 21, Berkshire represented the newest addition to their criminal enterprise, recruited from a Denver gambling hall where his mounting debts had made continued residence inadvisable. Unlike his older companions, Berkshire retained enough moral sensibility to feel uneasy about targeting a lone woman, though financial desperation had overruled his better instincts. "She looks mighty peaceful down there," Berkshire said hesitantly. "Maybe we should look for a different target. Plenty of other spreads in this territory that might have better pickings." Crenshaw's expression hardened as he turned his attention from the valley to his youngest associate. "Tommy, that kind of thinking is what keeps a man poor and hungry. You see a woman alone on a homestead, you see opportunity. She's got no way to defend what's hers, no neighbors close enough to hear trouble, and no lawmen within a day's hard ride. That's not a situation to pass by, that's a gift from Providence." Through his field glasses, Crenshaw had counted at least 8 horses in the small pasture behind Clara's cabin, including what appeared to be 2 magnificent Appaloosas, whose distinctive spotted coats suggested significant value to the right buyer. In the frontier territories, horses represented not just transportation, but survival itself, making them as valuable as gold to men willing to take what others had worked to acquire. A good horse could sell for $50 or more in the mining camps where men with suddenly heavy pockets cared little about previous ownership. "Besides," Morrison added, warming to the prospect, "woman like that probably has other valuables tucked away. Wedding gifts, maybe some gold her husband sent back from his mining claims. Could we walk away with more than just horseflesh?" What none of the 3 men could know was that Clara's seemingly peaceful morning routine was actually a carefully maintained pattern developed over 7 years of frontier living. Every movement, every pause, every seemingly casual glance contained layers of awareness that would have impressed the Blackfoot warriors who had raised her from age 12 to 27. The chicken coop she checked sat positioned to provide clear sight lines toward the eastern ridge where potential threats might observe her homestead. The vegetable garden she tended offered quick access to the cabin's rear entrance should rapid retreat become necessary. Most importantly, the way she moved between these tasks created the impression of predictable routine while actually varying her timing and positioning in subtle ways that would make her difficult to track or ambush. Clara had learned these lessons during 15 years with the Siksika Nation. Adopted as a daughter after her parents' wagon train had been attacked by rival Crow raiders in 1863, what had begun as captivity had evolved into genuine family bonds as she proved her adaptability and earned the respect of her Blackfoot mother, Spotted Eagle Woman, and her warrior father, Red Thunder. The skills she had acquired during those years tracking, hunting, fighting, and most crucially, the ability to read danger in the subtle signs most people overlooked, had been honed through daily practice in a world where weakness meant death. The irony was that Clara's current life as a settler's wife represented a conscious choice to embrace the white world she had been born into, not an abandonment of the skills that had kept her alive among the Blackfoot. When she had married Samuel Whitfield 3 years earlier, she had been honest about her background, and he had accepted not just her past, but the capabilities it had given her. Samuel understood that his wife was no ordinary frontier woman, which was why he felt comfortable leaving her alone for extended periods, while he worked the silver claims that provided their modest income. As the morning progressed, Clara went about her daily tasks with the same methodical attention to detail that had become second nature. She milked their 2 cows, gathered eggs from the chicken coop, and began preparing what appeared to be a solitary breakfast on the wood-burning stove inside the cabin. To Crenshaw and his men, watching from their concealed position, she presented exactly the image they hoped to see: a woman going about her domestic duties with no awareness of the threat observing her from the forest. What they couldn't detect was the way Clara's peripheral vision constantly monitored the ridgeline where morning sunlight might reflect off field glasses or metal. They couldn't hear how she paused periodically in her work to listen for sounds that didn't belong. The cry of a bird disturbed by human presence, the crack of a branch under an unwary foot, or the subtle change in wind patterns that might carry unfamiliar scents. Most critically, they had no way of knowing that Clara had already identified their presence nearly an hour earlier, when her trained eye had caught the brief glint of Crenshaw's field glasses among the pine trees. Inside the cabin, Clara's preparations took on a different character than her observers could possibly imagine. While appearing to prepare a simple breakfast, she was actually conducting a methodical inventory of her defensive resources. The Winchester rifle that Samuel kept mounted above the fireplace was loaded and ready, with additional ammunition stored in a drawer that could be reached quickly. The skinning knife she used for butchering game was sharp enough to serve as a formidable weapon if circumstances required close-quarters fighting. Most importantly, hidden beneath a loose floorboard near the kitchen table, lay items that connected her to her Blackfoot pasta war hatchet gifted by Red Thunder, a bow with a full quiver of arrows she had crafted herself, and other tools that represented skills few white settlers possessed. The layout of the cabin itself had been designed with defense in mind, though Samuel had allowed Clara to disguise these considerations as domestic preferences. Windows positioned to provide clear fields of fire appeared to be placed simply for natural light. The heavy wooden door could be barred from the inside, while a concealed exit through the root cellar offered escape routes that attacking enemies might not discover. Even the placement of furniture inside followed principles Clara had learned from Spotted Eagle Woman, creating cover positions while maintaining mobility through the interior space. As midday approached, Crenshaw's patience began wearing thin as he watched Clara's seemingly routine activities. The sun was climbing higher, making their position on the exposed ridge less tenable, while increasing the likelihood that other travelers might pass through the valley and complicate their planned operation. He had built his reputation on swift, decisive action that left little time for resistance or pursuit, and extended observation was beginning to feel like wasted opportunity. "Time to move," he announced to his companions, lowering the field glasses and checking the loads in his revolver. "Woman's had all morning to show us if there's any surprises waiting down there. Looks like she's exactly what we thought, alone and helpless." Morrison eagerly checked his own weapons while Berkshire continued to display obvious nervousness about their intended target. The youngest member of their group had hoped that extended observation might reveal some reason to abandon their plan, but Clara's apparently innocent activities had provided no such excuse. She seemed to be exactly what she appeared, a frontier wife managing her homestead while her husband worked distant mining claims. "What's the approach?" Morrison asked, already anticipating the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with action. After patient planning, straight down the ridge and across the valley floor, or circle around and come up from the creek side. Crenshaw studied the terrain below while formulating his tactical plan. The homestead sat in a natural clearing surrounded by gentle hills that offered multiple approach routes while providing excellent visibility of anyone trying to flee or summon help. The nearest neighbor was probably 10 miles away across difficult terrain, making rescue or reinforcement highly unlikely. Law enforcement existed mainly in the larger towns like Helena and Billings, too far away to respond to remote homestead troubles. "We'll split up," Crenshaw decided. "Jake, you come with me straight down the main trail. Make it look like we're just passing through, maybe needing water for our horses. Tommy, you circle around to the west and get between the cabin and that creek. If she tries to run, you cut her off. Once we're in position, we make our intentions clear and take what we came for." The plan reflected standard tactics that had served them well in previous operations. Appear non-threatening initially to avoid triggering defensive reactions. Establish control through superior positioning and numbers, then execute swiftly to minimize resistance. Most frontier women faced with multiple armed men and no immediate prospect of rescue would submit to demands rather than risk violence that they had no hope of surviving. What Crenshaw couldn't factor into his calculations was that Clara represented a completely different category of opponent than he had previously encountered. Her apparent vulnerability was not the result of genuine helplessness, but rather a conscious choice to blend into the white settler community that had become her new home. Beneath the calico dress and domestic routine lay reflexes honed by 15 years of survival training in one of the most warrior-oriented cultures on the Great Plains. As the three men began their descent from the ridge, moving with the practiced stealth of experienced criminals, Clara was already implementing countermeasures based on her own tactical assessment of the developing situation. She had identified 3 distinct approach routes they might use, and had prepared responses for each possibility. More importantly, she had decided that the time for maintaining her peaceful facade was rapidly approaching an end. The morning that had begun with the simple image of a frontier wife tending her homestead was about to transform into something far more complex and dangerous. Clara Whitfield was ready to remind these would-be horse thieves that appearances on the frontier could be fatally deceptive, and that some prey was far more dangerous than predators anticipated. In the corral behind the cabin, the 8 horses that had attracted Crenshaw's attention continued grazing peacefully, unaware that their ownership was about to become a matter of deadly contention. Among them, 2 magnificent Appaloosas raised their heads briefly as unfamiliar scents carried on the morning breeze, their instincts detecting approaching danger even as their human protector prepared to meet it with skills learned in a world where survival demanded deadly competence. The descent from the eastern ridge required nearly 40 minutes as Crenshaw and Morrison picked their way through dense undergrowth and scattered deadfall, their horses stepping carefully along game trails barely wide enough for single-file passage. Behind them, Tommy Berkshire had separated to take the longer western route that would bring him to the creekside of Clara's property, his nervousness evident in the way he constantly checked and rechecked his weapons while navigating the treacherous slope. Clara had tracked their progress through subtle indicators that would have been invisible to most settlers. The sudden silence of a meadowlark whose territory encompassed the eastern approach told her when the first group had reached the halfway point. A red-tailed hawk's agitated cry from the western valley indicated where the third man was making his circuitous journey toward her property. Most telling of all was the behavior of her horses, whose ears periodically swiveled toward sounds that human hearing couldn't detect, confirming that multiple riders were converging on her homestead from different directions, moving with deliberate calm. Clara made her final preparations while maintaining the appearance of ordinary domestic activity. She brought her laundry inside from the line, folding each piece with methodical precision while positioning herself near the kitchen window that offered the best view of the main trail. The Winchester above the fireplace remained in its familiar position, but Clara had quietly chambered around and verified the safety was easily accessible. More importantly, she had loosened the floorboard, concealing her Blackfoot weapons, ensuring that war hatchet and bow would be available within seconds if conventional firearms proved insufficient. Her movements carried none of the frantic energy that panic might have produced. Instead, Clara drew upon lessons learned during countless hunting expeditions with Red Thunder, where patience and measured preparation often meant the difference between successful hunts and empty-handed returns. Blackfoot had taught her that rushed actions born of fear led to mistakes that could prove fatal, while controlled responses based on careful observation gave even outnumbered warriors significant advantages over careless enemies. As she folded the last shirt from her laundry basket, Clara caught her first clear glimpse of the approaching riders through the stand of aspen trees that bordered the main trail. 2 men on horseback, moving at the unhurried pace that travelers might adopt when seeking water and rest at an isolated homestead. Their posture suggested casual intentions, but Clara's trained eye noticed details that revealed their true nature. The way they rode with hands positioned near weapons while scanning the property for threats or opportunities. The manner in which they communicated through subtle gestures rather than conversation, coordinating their approach with professional efficiency. Most significantly, Clara observed how their horses showed signs of hard travel despite the men's apparent leisure-lathered flanks and labored breathing that suggested they had covered substantial distance at considerable speed before adopting their current casual pace. Men with legitimate business rarely rode their mounts to exhaustion before making social calls on isolated homesteads. Crenshaw reined in his horse approximately 50 yards from the cabin, close enough to establish clear communication while maintaining sufficient distance to retreat quickly if the situation developed unfavorably. He removed his hat in a gesture of frontier courtesy, revealing iron-gray hair that framed a face weathered by decades of outdoor living. His smile appeared genuine enough to fool most observers, though Clara noticed how his eyes continued their methodical assessment of her property's defenses and opportunities. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Morning, ma'am," Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying the practiced friendliness of a man accustomed to gaining trust before betraying it. "Beautiful day to be working around the homestead. Hope we're not disturbing your routine." Clara appeared at her front door with a dish towel in her hands, playing the role of a housewife momentarily interrupted in her domestic duties. Her response carried the cautious politeness that frontier women typically displayed when encountering unexpected visitors, especially armed men whose intentions remained unclear. "Good morning, gentlemen," she replied, her tone neither welcoming nor dismissive. "You're welcome to water your horses at the creek if they need refreshment. Looks like you've been traveling hard." The observation about their horses' condition served dual purposes, demonstrating neighborly concern while subtly indicating that Clara possessed enough experience with livestock to recognize signs of exhausted animals. Crenshaw filed this detail away as he continued his preliminary assessment of the woman he intended to rob. "Much obliged for the offer," Crenshaw responded, gesturing toward Morrison to dismount and lead their horses toward the creek. "We've been pushing pretty hard since daybreak, hoping to reach the mining camps before the weather turns. Heard tell there's early snow possible in the high country." The explanation provided plausible justification for their presence while establishing their supposed destination and timeline. Clara nodded with apparent understanding, though she noted several inconsistencies in Crenshaw's story. Men traveling to the mining camps typically followed the established stage route rather than the more difficult trails that led through Clearwater Valley. More significantly, their equipment and supplies suggested men prepared for extended outdoor living rather than the brief journey to established mining communities that Crenshaw described. "The passes can be treacherous this time of year," Clara agreed, maintaining her role as a helpful neighbor while continuing her own assessment of the threat these men represented. "My husband Samuel works near Helena, and he's always careful about weather conditions when traveling back and forth." The mention of her husband served to establish that Clara wasn't entirely alone while avoiding specific details about Samuel's current whereabouts or expected return. It was a standard frontier precaution that most travelers would understand and respect. Though Clara doubted these particular visitors harbored legitimate concerns about her welfare, Morrison had dismounted and was leading both horses toward the creek, but Clara noticed how his route took him unnecessarily close to her horse corral, where he paused to examine her livestock with obvious interest. His attention focused particularly on the two Appaloosas, whose distinctive markings and evident quality would command premium prices in any market where stolen horses might be sold. "Those are fine-looking animals you've got there," Morrison commented, running an appraising eye over the horses while keeping his voice conversational. "Don't often see Appaloosas of that quality this far from tribal territories. Your husband must have quite an eye for horseflesh." The observation carried undertones that made Clara's muscles tense despite her outwardly calm demeanor. Morrison's knowledge of horse breeding and his specific interest in her most valuable animals confirmed her suspicions about their true intentions. Men seeking water and shelter rarely paid such detailed attention to livestock that didn't belong to them. "Samuel has always appreciated good horses," Clara replied carefully, moving slightly closer to her door while maintaining the pretense of casual conversation. "We've been fortunate to acquire some quality breeding stock over the years." As she spoke, Clara's peripheral vision caught movement near the western edge of her property where Tommy Berkshire was approaching, through the scattered cottonwoods that lined the creek. His attempt at stealth was competent, but not expert, revealing his position to eyes trained in tracking by Blackfoot hunters, who could follow day-old trails across solid rock. The youngest member of their group carried himself with the nervous energy of someone uncomfortable with his assigned role, frequently checking his weapons and surroundings in ways that betrayed his inexperience with criminal enterprise. Crenshaw had also noticed Berkshire's approach, though he concealed his awareness better than his younger associate managed concealment. The gang leader's smile remained fixed as he continued the pretense of friendly travelers, but Clara detected subtle changes in his posture that indicated readiness for immediate action. His right hand had shifted closer to his holstered revolver, while his horse was positioned for rapid movement in any direction circumstances might require. "You mentioned your husband works the mining camps," Crenshaw said, his tone carrying casual curiosity that didn't quite mask his fishing for information about Clara's current level of protection. "Must be difficult being out here alone while he's away. Lot of rough characters traveling these parts these days." The comment represented a transition from apparently innocent conversation toward more pointed inquiries about Clara's vulnerability and available defenses. It was a technique Crenshaw had employed successfully in previous operations, using expressions of concern to gather intelligence about targets while establishing justification for whatever actions might follow. "A woman learns to take care of herself out here," Clara responded, allowing a slight edge to enter her voice that suggested she wasn't entirely naive about frontier dangers. "Samuel made sure I knew how to handle any troubles that might arise while he's working his claims." The statement served notice that Clara wasn't the helpless victim Crenshaw might have hoped to find, though she deliberately kept the warning vague enough to avoid triggering immediate hostile action. In her experience with both white settlements and Blackfoot bands, displays of competence often deterred casual predators while avoiding the escalation that direct threats might provoke. Morrison finished watering the horses and returned to the area near Clara's front porch, but instead of remounting, he began examining the cabin's construction with obvious interest. His attention focused on details that had little relevance to casual travelers: the quality of the door hinges, the positioning of windows, the layout of outbuildings that might contain valuable supplies or equipment. "Solid construction," Morrison observed, running his hand along the log walls while maintaining his facade of innocent admiration. "Your husband's a skilled builder. Must have taken considerable time and effort to establish a homestead like this." Clara recognized the assessment for what it truly was: reconnaissance of her defenses and possible escape routes, conducted under the guise of polite conversation. Morrison was evaluating how easily the cabin might be breached if their intentions shifted from deception to direct assault. His professional interest in structural details confirmed that these men had extensive experience with forced entry and property seizure. "Samuel and I worked together on most of the construction," Clara replied truthfully, though she omitted the fact that much of her building knowledge had come from helping construct Blackfoot lodges and winter shelters during her years with the tribe. "We believed in building something that would last through whatever hardships the territory might bring." The reference to hardships carried subtle warning that Clara was prepared for various forms of trouble, though she continued to avoid specifics that might force immediate confrontation. Her strategy focused on gradually revealing competence while maintaining enough ambiguity to keep her true capabilities concealed until circumstances required their deployment. Berkshire had now reached the creek, bank approximately 40 yards west of the cabin, positioning himself where he could intercept anyone attempting to flee in that direction. His nervous energy remained obvious despite his efforts at concealment, manifesting in constant fidgeting with his rifle and frequent glances toward Crenshaw for guidance about when to abandon their pretense of innocent travelers. The youngest gang members' discomfort with their intended crime was becoming increasingly apparent as the deception continued. Unlike his older and more experienced companions, Berkshire lacked the emotional detachment necessary for professional criminal activity. His conscience clearly troubled him about targeting a lone woman, even as financial desperation prevented him from abandoning an enterprise that promised substantial profit. "Your husband's a fortunate man," Crenshaw said, his tone shifting subtly, as he prepared to transition from reconnaissance to action. "Not many men can leave their wives alone with confidence that everything will be properly maintained in their absence. Of course, that kind of trust can be dangerous in territory where not everyone respects the law." The comment represented another escalation in Crenshaw's psychological pressure campaign, moving from implied concern toward veiled threats about Clara's isolation and vulnerability. It was a standard technique designed to create fear while providing plausible deniability if witnesses later questioned the conversation. Men could always claim they had been expressing legitimate worry about a woman's safety rather than threatening her security. Clara felt familiar patterns of readiness flowing through her body as the situation approached its inevitable transition from deception to violence. Her breathing deepened and slowed according to techniques Spotted Eagle Woman had taught her for maintaining calm during dangerous confrontations. Her awareness expanded to encompass every detail of her surroundings, the position of each man, the location of available cover, the distance to various weapons and escape routes. "The law reaches farther than most people realize," Clara replied, her voice carrying quiet confidence that suggested resources beyond what appeared immediately available. "Sheriff Morrison in Helena takes a dim view of anyone who troubles law-abiding settlers, regardless of how remote their properties might be." The reference to law enforcement was partially bluff, since Helena's jurisdiction rarely extended effective protection to isolated homesteads like hers. However, the mention served to remind her visitors that criminal activities carried potential consequences, while avoiding direct accusations that might trigger immediate violence. Crenshaw's expression hardened slightly as Clara's responses continued to display more backbone than he preferred in his victims. Most frontier women, faced with multiple armed men and no visible protection, would have shown greater signs of fear and submission by this point in the conversation. Clara's measured responses and apparent lack of intimidation suggested either remarkable courage or hidden resources that could complicate his planned operation. "Sheriff Morrison's a good man, I'm sure," Crenshaw agreed, though his tone carried skeptical undertones about the relevance of distant law enforcement to current circumstances. "Of course, even the best lawmen can't be everywhere at once. Takes time to respond to troubles in remote locations like this valley." The observation represented Crenshaw's most direct statement yet about Clara's isolation and the limited likelihood of outside intervention if the situation deteriorated. He was systematically eliminating her potential sources of assistance, while building justification for whatever actions he intended to take. Morrison had completed his reconnaissance of the cabin's exterior and was now examining the horse corral with renewed interest, counting animals and assessing their individual value with the practiced eye of someone familiar with livestock markets. His attention remained focused particularly on the Appaloosas, whose breeding and condition suggested they could command prices well above ordinary ranch horses. "Hate to impose further on your hospitality," Morrison called to Clara while continuing his examination of her horses, "but we've got some trading business in the mining camps." Always interested in quality animals if folks are looking to sell. Those spotted horses of yours would bring premium prices from miners with heavy pockets. The offer represented the gang's first direct expression of interest in Clara's property, though it maintained the pretense of legitimate business transaction. Morrison was testing Clara's willingness to part with her most valuable possessions voluntarily before Crenshaw decided whether more forceful persuasion would be necessary. "Samuel and I aren't looking to sell," Clara replied firmly, allowing steel to enter her voice for the first time since the conversation began. "Those horses represent years of careful breeding, and we have plans for expanding our operations." The refusal eliminated the possibility of voluntary transaction, though Clara had never believed these men intended to pay fair prices for anything they decided to take. Her firm rejection served notice that she wouldn't be easily intimidated into surrendering her property, while avoiding language that might be construed as direct challenge to their intentions. Crenshaw exchanged meaningful glances with Morrison, their silent communication indicating readiness to abandon diplomatic approaches in favor of more direct methods. The gang leader's patience with reconnaissance and negotiation was clearly approaching its limits, particularly since Clara had shown none of the fear and compliance he required for easy completion of their criminal enterprise. "That's unfortunate," Crenshaw said, his voice dropping to a more serious register as he abandoned the pretense of friendly conversation. "We were hoping to conclude our business amicably, but sometimes circumstances require more direct negotiations." The shift in tone represented Crenshaw's final warning before transitioning to open threats and demands. Clara recognized the psychological technique offering one last opportunity for voluntary compliance before demonstrating the consequences of continued resistance. It was a standard criminal approach designed to make victims feel they had brought subsequent violence upon themselves through unreasonable stubbornness. "I've been quite clear about our position," Clara replied, her own voice becoming colder as she prepared for the confrontation that could no longer be avoided. "My husband and I aren't interested in selling our livestock to passing strangers, regardless of what prices they might offer." As she spoke, Clara's hand moved with studied casualness toward the door handle behind her, positioning herself for rapid retreat into the cabin where her weapons waited in prepared positions. The time for maintaining pretense was rapidly approaching its end, and she needed to be ready for immediate action when Crenshaw finally revealed his true intentions. The morning sun had climbed higher during their extended conversation, casting shorter shadows that reduced the available concealment around Clara's property. Birds that had fallen silent during the stranger's approach were beginning to resume their normal activities, though their calls carried the nervous quality that indicated continued awareness of potential threat. In the horse corral, the Appaloosas that had attracted Morrison's attention raised their heads and whinnied softly, their animal instincts detecting the rising tension among the humans whose conversation had gradually shifted from friendly to ominous. The other horses responded to their alarm, creating a subtle but noticeable increase in activity that reflected the changing dynamics of the confrontation. Berkshire remained positioned near the creek, but his nervousness had reached levels that threatened to compromise whatever tactical advantage his concealment might have provided. His constant movement and obvious agitation would be visible to anyone who knew where to look, making his position more liability than asset for the gang's intended operation. The stage was now set for the transition from psychological pressure to direct action, with all participants positioned according to their individual strengths and intentions. Clara had identified each man's location and assessed their probable capabilities, while maintaining her defensive options and concealing her true level of preparedness. Crenshaw had gathered the intelligence he believed necessary for successful completion of their criminal enterprise, though his assessment of Clara's vulnerability was about to prove catastrophically inaccurate. The peaceful morning that had begun with domestic routine was about to transform into something far more dangerous, as three horse thieves discovered that frontier appearances could be fatally deceptive. The moment Crenshaw's facade finally cracked, Clara felt the familiar surge of clarity that had saved her life countless times during her years with the Blackfoot. Time seemed to slow as her senses heightened, taking in every detail of the three men's positions, their weapons, and the terrain that would soon become a battlefield. The peaceful Homestead morning was about to transform into something far deadlier than these horse thieves could possibly anticipate. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding about the nature of our business here," Crenshaw said, his voice dropping to the cold tone of a man who had abandoned all pretense. His right hand moved deliberately to rest on his gun butt, not drawing but making his intentions unmistakably clear. "We're not exactly in the business of taking no for an answer when it comes to acquiring quality livestock." Clara's response was measured and calm, though every muscle in her body had shifted into the coiled readiness that Red Thunder had drilled into her during countless training sessions. "I believe I understand your business perfectly, Mr. Crenshaw. The question is whether you understand mine." The use of his name sent a visible shock through the gang leader's composure. Clara had gleaned it from Morrison's earlier slip during their conversation, but her casual deployment of the information suggested knowledge and preparation that Crenshaw hadn't anticipated. His calculating eyes narrowed as he reassessed the woman standing before him, recognizing for the first time that she might represent something more complex than an isolated frontier wife. "Smart woman," Crenshaw acknowledged grimly. "Smarter than most we encounter in our line of work. But intelligence doesn't change the fundamental mathematics of your situation. 3 armed men against 1 woman, no matter how clever, tends to work out in predictable ways." Morrison had moved closer to the horse corral during this exchange, his own weapon now visible as he made no further effort to conceal his criminal intentions. His earlier nervous energy had transformed into the focused alertness of a predator preparing to strike. The valuable Appaloosas represented a significant payday, and he clearly intended to claim them regardless of their owner's objections. "Those are fine animals, ma'am," Morrison called out, his tone carrying mockery where earlier it had held false courtesy. "Shame to see them wasted on someone who doesn't appreciate the realities of frontier life. Men like us, we understand that. Ownership is really just a matter of who's strong enough to keep what they claim." From his position near the creek, Tommy Berkshire had emerged from concealment, but remained noticeably reluctant to draw his weapon. His youth and inexperience with serious criminal activity were evident in his hesitant movements and troubled expression. Unlike his companions, Berkshire still struggled with the moral implications of what they intended to do. "Silas, maybe we should reconsider this," Berkshire called out, his voice carrying doubt that undermined the gang's united front. "This lady hasn't done anything to deserve what we're planning. Plenty of other opportunities out there that don't involve threatening decent folks." Crenshaw's expression darkened at this display of weakness from his youngest associate. Criminal enterprises required unity of purpose, and Berkshire's public wavering threatened to compromise their operation. "Tommy, you signed on for this life when you joined us. Time to decide whether you're committed to seeing it through, or if you need to find a different line of work." The tension between the gang members created an opening that Clara filed away for potential exploitation. Divisions within enemy ranks often provided opportunities for those skilled enough to recognize and leverage them. During her years with the Blackfoot, she had witnessed how internal discord could transform organized threats into manageable problems. Clara stepped backward toward her cabin door, her movement appearing like retreat while actually positioning her closer to the weapons she had prepared inside. Her apparent withdrawal seemed to embolden Crenshaw, who interpreted it as the first sign of the fear and submission he expected from his victims. "Sensible approach, ma'am," Crenshaw said, urging his horse forward several steps to maintain psychological pressure. "Nobody needs to get hurt if we handle this transaction in a businesslike manner. Hand over the keys to that horse corral. Maybe tell us where you keep any cash or valuables, and will be on our way without any unpleasantness. The demand represented Crenshaw's preferred method of operation, using the threat of violence to secure voluntary compliance, rather than engaging in actual combat that might result in injury to his men or damage to the property he intended to steal. Most frontier settlers, faced with overwhelming odds and no prospect of assistance, would choose survival over futile resistance. "I'm afraid that's not possible," Clara replied, her hand finding the door handle behind her. "These horses belong to my husband and me. We've worked years to build this herd, and I won't simply hand it over to passing thieves." Her defiant response triggered a flash of anger in Crenshaw's eyes. The gang leader was accustomed to intimidation, producing rapid compliance, and Clara's continued resistance suggested either remarkable courage or hidden resources that could complicate his carefully planned operation. Either possibility represented unacceptable deviation from his preferred criminal methodology. "Ma'am, you're forcing us into courses of action that nobody wants to pursue," Crenshaw warned, drawing his revolver, though keeping it pointed toward the ground rather than directly at Clara. "I've been patient because I prefer civilized solutions to business disputes, but patience has its limits." Morrison had also drawn his weapon, a well-maintained Colt that gleamed in the morning sunlight. His positioning near the horse corral provided clear sight lines to both Clara and the cabin entrance, cutting off her most obvious escape route, while maintaining control over the livestock that represented their primary objective. "Last chance to be reasonable," Morrison added, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of a man who had used violence to solve problems throughout his adult life. "We're taking those horses one way or another. Question is whether you'll be alive to tell your husband what happened when he gets back from his mining claims." The explicit threat marked a crucial escalation in their confrontation. Clara recognized that the time for psychological maneuvering had passed, replaced by the immediate necessity of physical action. Her years of Blackfoot training had prepared her for exactly this moment when words failed and survival depended on skill, speed, and decisive action. "Gentlemen," Clara said quietly, her voice carrying new undertones that should have warned experienced criminals they were dealing with something unexpected. "I believe you've made a serious error in judgment about who you've chosen to threaten." Before any of the three men could react to the ominous change in her demeanor, Clara had slipped through her cabin door and secured it behind her. The heavy wooden barrier, designed according to principles she had learned from Spotted Eagle Woman, would provide temporary protection while she retrieved the weapons that would transform their confrontation from intimidation to genuine combat. Crenshaw's roar of anger echoed across the valley as he realized his prey had escaped the open ground, where his numerical advantage would have been decisive. "Jake, get around to the back of that cabin. Tommy, you stay on the creek side. Nobody gets in or out of that place without us knowing about it." The gang leader's experience with frontier criminal activity had taught him the importance of containment. When dealing with fortified positions, most cabins had limited entry points, and controlling those access routes typically forced occupants into surrender when they realized escape was impossible. What Crenshaw couldn't know was that Clara's cabin had been designed with defense in mind, incorporating features that would give a prepared defender significant advantages over attacking forces. Inside the cabin, Clara moved with swift efficiency toward the loose floorboard that concealed her Blackfoot weapons. The Winchester rifle above the fireplace represented conventional frontier armament that her attackers would expect and prepare for. The war hatchet and bow hidden beneath the floor offered capabilities that would come as complete surprises to men accustomed to fighting settlers armed only with standard firearms. The war hatchet, crafted by Red Thunder himself and blessed by tribal medicine men, balanced perfectly in Clara's hand as she lifted it from its concealment. Its steel blade had been forged from railroad iron and honed to razor sharpness, while the handle bore intricate beadwork that told the story of her adoption into the Blackfoot Nation. This weapon represented not just a tool of war, but a symbol of her true identity, the identity these horse thieves had failed to recognize beneath her settler's disguise. The bow required more careful handling. Its compound construction, incorporating both traditional materials and techniques learned from white traders. Clara had crafted it herself during her final years with the tribe, using skills passed down through generations of Blackfoot hunters and warriors. The arrows in the accompanying quiver bore steel points that could penetrate leather clothing and wooden barriers with devastating effectiveness. Morrison had reached the rear of the cabin and was testing the back door, finding it as solidly constructed as the front entrance. His frustration was evident in the increasingly violent way he rattled the handle and pushed against the wooden frame. "Silas, this place is built like a fort. Gonna take more than polite knocking to get inside. Then stop being polite," Crenshaw shouted back, his own patience finally exhausted by Clara's unexpected resistance. "Break down whatever you need to break down. We didn't come all this way to be stopped by one stubborn woman." The gang leader's fury was compounded by recognition that their simple horse theft was evolving into a complex siege that increased their exposure to discovery by other travelers or law enforcement. Every minute spent subduing Clara's resistance multiplied the risks associated with their criminal enterprise. Berkshire remained near the creek, but his obvious reluctance to participate in violent assault on a woman was becoming more pronounced. As the situation escalated, his weapon remained holstered despite Crenshaw's orders, and his body language suggested an internal conflict between financial necessity and moral reservations. "Silas, this doesn't feel right," Berkshire called out, his voice carrying distress that further undermined gang unity. "Maybe we should cut our losses and find easier pickings somewhere else. This lady's shown more fight than most men would in her situation." Crenshaw's response was immediate and harsh. "Tommy, you draw that gun and cover your assigned position. Or you ride out of here right now without your share of anything we take. I won't have weak-stomached partners endangering operations because they're too squeamish to handle necessary business." The ultimatum forced Berkshire to choose between his conscience and his desperate need for the money this operation might provide. After a moment of visible internal struggle, he reluctantly drew his revolver, though his grip remained uncertain, and his aim unfocused. Inside the cabin, Clara had completed her weapons preparation and was now assessing the tactical situation through windows, positioned to provide comprehensive coverage of the surrounding terrain. The cabin's defensive design incorporated lessons learned from both Blackfoot military architecture and white frontier construction techniques, creating a structure that could withstand sustained assault while providing multiple options for counterattack. Morrison had begun attempting to force the rear door using his rifle butt as a battering ram, each impact sending vibrations through the cabin's log walls. His technique was crude but potentially effective, as repeated blows might eventually damage the hinges or frame enough to create entry. However, his focus on the door made him vulnerable to unexpected attack from directions he hadn't considered. Clara moved silently to the rear window that overlooked Morrison's position, her bow already strung and an arrow nocked. The distance was less than 20 yards, an easy shot for someone trained in Blackfoot archery techniques. More importantly, Morrison's position against the cabin wall provided no cover from angles he hadn't anticipated, making him a perfect target for weapons he didn't know existed. Drawing the bowstring to full extension, Clara took careful aim at Morrison's right shoulder. Her intention was to disable rather than kill, though she remained prepared to use lethal force if circumstances demanded it. The arrow would punch through his shirt and into muscle tissue, causing immediate incapacitation. While avoiding vital organs that might result in fatal injury, the arrow's flight was silent and true, striking Morrison with devastating accuracy. Before he could react to movement in the window above him, his scream of pain and shock echoed across the valley as the steel point drove deep into his shoulder. the impact spinning him away from the door and sending his rifle clattering across the wooden porch. "What the hell?" Crenshaw roared, unable to see Morrison's position from his location near the front of the cabin. "Jake, what's happening back there?" Morrison's response was a series of curses and groans as he struggled to comprehend what had just happened to him. The arrow protruding from his shoulder represented a weapon he hadn't anticipated facing on the frontier, where most conflicts involved firearms rather than traditional archery. His immediate concern shifted from forcing entry to seeking cover from an enemy whose capabilities clearly exceeded his expectations. "She shot me with an arrow," Morrison gasped, pressing his left hand against the wound while trying to retreat to a position where he wouldn't be visible from the cabin windows. Where the hell did a settler's wife get Indian weapons? The question revealed the fundamental error in Crenshaw's assessment of their target. Clara wasn't simply a frontier woman who had learned to use conventional firearms for protection. She was something far more dangerous, a white woman trained in Native American warfare techniques that most settlers never encountered and wouldn't know how to counter. Crenshaw's tactical calculation shifted immediately as he processed this new information. His carefully planned horse theft had become an engagement with an opponent whose capabilities and resources remained largely unknown. The mathematical certainty of 3 armed men overwhelming one isolated woman had been replaced by a complex military situation requiring new strategies and heightened caution. "Tommy, get over here now," Crenshaw commanded, recognizing that his gang's dispersed positioning had become a liability rather than an advantage. "We need to concentrate our forces and reassess what we're dealing with." Berkshire's relief at being called away from direct participation in the assault was evident as he abandoned his position near the creek and began moving toward Crenshaw's location. His inexperience with serious criminal activity had left him unprepared for the violence and complexity that Clara's resistance had introduced to their operation. From her position inside the cabin, Clara had already moved away from the rear window and was repositioning to address the next phase of the confrontation. Morrison's injury would reduce the gang's effective strength while demonstrating capabilities they hadn't anticipated. More importantly, their initial tactical deployment had been disrupted, forcing them to regroup under circumstances that favored defensive rather than offensive operations. The war hatchet felt familiar and reassuring in her left hand while she maintained her grip on the bow with her right. These weapons represented skills that few white settlers possessed, giving her significant advantages over enemies prepared only for conventional frontier combat. The horse thieves had chosen to threaten someone whose true nature remained hidden beneath the facade of civilized domesticity. As Crenshaw began issuing new orders to his remaining effective associates, Clara prepared for the next phase of a confrontation that had already exceeded their expectations in terms of complexity and danger. The peaceful morning that had begun with domestic routine had transformed into a test of survival skills learned during 15 years among warriors who had never accepted defeat. The 3 men who had anticipated an easy theft of valuable horses were about to discover that they had chosen to threaten the wrong homestead and the wrong woman. Clara Whitfield's true capabilities were finally being revealed, and the results would be far more devastating than anything they had prepared to face. Morrison's agonized cries had transformed the tactical landscape entirely. As he pressed himself against the cabin's rear wall, struggling to stem the bleeding from the arrow wound that had punched through his shoulder, the reality of their situation began crystallizing for all 3 gang members. This was no longer a simple horse theft involving an isolated frontier woman. They had stumbled into something far more dangerous and complex. Crenshaw dismounted from his horse and took cover behind a large pine tree near the cabin's front corner, his mind racing through implications that challenged every assumption he had made about their target. In 20 years of criminal activity across multiple territories, he had never encountered a white woman who possessed Native American archery skills of such deadly precision. The arrow's placement had been surgical, disabling Morrison without killing him, suggesting not only accuracy, but tactical restraint that indicated military-level training. "Jake, can you move?" Crenshaw called out, his voice carrying new urgency as he attempted to assess his gang's remaining capabilities. Morrison's response was a series of labored breaths, punctuated by curses that confirmed the shoulder wound had effectively eliminated him from active participation in any assault. "Can't use my right arm," Morrison gasped, his voice tight with pain as he examined the arrow shaft protruding from his shoulder. "Bleeding pretty bad, and I dropped my rifle when she hit me. Silas, this woman ain't what we thought she was. Nobody learns to shoot like that just living on a homestead." The observation confirmed what Crenshaw was already beginning to suspect. Clara Whitfield represented something unprecedented in his criminal experience. Frontier women occasionally demonstrated competence with firearms, but the precision archery that had wounded Morrison suggested training in traditional Native American warfare techniques that few whites ever acquired. Tommy Berkshire had reached Crenshaw's position near the front of the cabin, his face pale with shock at hearing Morrison's cries of pain. The young man's already fragile commitment to their criminal enterprise was crumbling rapidly as violence replaced the theoretical crime he had imagined when joining the gang. "Silas, we need to get Jake to a doctor," Berkshire said urgently, his moral reservations now reinforced by practical concerns about his wounded companion. "That arrow went deep, and he's losing blood fast. This whole situation has gone way beyond what we signed up for." Crenshaw's expression hardened as he weighed operational considerations against the welfare of his injured associate. Morrison's wound was serious but probably not life-threatening if treated promptly, though transporting him to medical care would require abandoning their current operation. More significantly, retreat would mean accepting defeat at the hands of a single woman, a humiliation that could destroy his reputation among the criminal networks that provided future opportunities. "We're not running from one woman, no matter what tricks she's learned," Crenshaw declared, though his voice carried less conviction than his words suggested. "There's got to be a way to get inside that cabin and finish what we started. Those horses are worth too much to walk away empty-handed." From her position inside the cabin, Clara could hear their muted conversation through the log walls, though individual words remained indistinct. The tone and urgency suggested heated debate about continuing their assault versus tactical withdrawal, exactly the kind of discord she hoped to encourage among enemies, whose unity was their primary advantage. Moving silently to the front window, Clara assessed the revised positioning of her remaining active opponents. Crenshaw had taken cover behind substantial timber that would stop arrows, while Berkshire remained exposed near the cabin's front corner. Morrison was effectively neutralized, though his position against the rear wall meant she couldn't determine his exact condition without exposing herself to potential return fire. The war hatchet in her left hand felt perfectly balanced as Clara considered her next tactical move. Red Thunder had taught her that psychological warfare often proved more effective than direct assault when facing multiple opponents, particularly enemies whose morale and coordination were already compromised. Creating fear and uncertainty could achieve objectives that conventional fighting might not accomplish without significant risk. Clara's knowledge of Blackfoot war tactics included techniques for psychological intimidation that could demoralize enemies even before physical combat began. The key was demonstrating capabilities that exceeded opponent expectations while maintaining an aura of unpredictability that prevented effective countermeasures. Moving to the cabin side window that faced the pine tree where Crenshaw had taken cover, Clara nocked an arrow and drew her bowstring to full extension. Her target wasn't the gang leader himself, who remained concealed behind adequate protection, but rather his horse standing nearby in the open. The animal represented both transportation and valuable property. Its loss would significantly complicate their escape while demonstrating her ability to strike targets they couldn't protect. The arrow flew with deadly accuracy, striking the horse in the neck and severing the carotid artery with surgical precision. The animal collapsed immediately, its death throes sending blood spraying across the ground near Crenshaw's position. The gang leader's shocked curses echoed across the valley as he realized the implications of losing his primary means of transportation. "She killed my horse," Crenshaw roared, his professional composure finally cracking under the stress of facing an opponent whose capabilities continued to exceed his understanding. What kind of woman knows how to kill a horse with one arrow shot? The answer to his question lay in 15 years of Blackfoot training that had taught Clara not just archery, but the precise anatomy of various animals and the most effective methods for bringing them down quickly. Horses were particularly vulnerable to arrows placed in specific locations, and Clara's education had included comprehensive instruction in both hunting and warfare applications of traditional weapons. Berkshire's reaction to the horse's death was immediate and decisive. The young man's face went white as he watched the animal's blood spreading across the ground, the violent reality of their situation finally overwhelming his already fragile commitment to criminal activity. "That's it, I'm done," Berkshire announced, backing away from the cabin while holstering his weapon. "Silas, this woman is going to kill us all if we keep pushing this. I signed on to steal horses, not to fight some kind of Indian warrior who can put arrows exactly where she wants them." Crenshaw's fury at this display of cowardice was evident in his snarled response. "Tommy, you run now and you'll never work with any gang west of the Mississippi. Word gets out that you abandoned partners in a fight, and you'll be lucky to find work mucking out stables." The threat carried weight in criminal circles where reputation determined future opportunities, but Berkshire's fear had reached levels that overwhelmed practical considerations about his professional future. Watching Clara systematically dismantle their operation with weapons and skills they couldn't counter had convinced him that survival required immediate retreat, regardless of long-term consequences. "Better alive and broke than dead with a reputation," Berkshire replied, continuing his withdrawal toward Morrison's horse, which remained the gang's only reliable means of transportation. "You want to keep fighting someone who fights like that, you do it without me." Clara observed Berkshire's retreat through her front window, noting his obvious panic and the way his departure further isolated Crenshaw from potential support. Psychological pressure she had applied was achieving its intended effect, fragmenting enemy unity and forcing individual survival calculations that prioritized personal safety over collective objectives. From the rear of the cabin, Morrison's voice called out with increasing desperation. "Silas, I need help back here. This bleeding isn't stopping, and I'm starting to feel dizzy. We need to get out of here before I pass out completely." The wounded gang member's deteriorating condition added urgency to Crenshaw's tactical dilemma. Continuing the assault risked Morrison's life while offering uncertain prospects for success against an opponent whose capabilities remained largely unknown. Retreat would preserve his surviving associates, but meant accepting total defeat at the hands of a single woman. Clara decided to press her psychological advantage by emerging from the cabin's front door, though she remained positioned where she could retreat quickly if circumstances required. Her appearance was calculated to maximize intimidation effect, war hatchet gleaming in one hand, bow ready in the other, her clothing and demeanor suggesting someone completely comfortable with weapons most frontier settlers had never seen used in combat. "Mr. Crenshaw," she called out, her voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who held tactical advantage and knew how to use it. "I believe your associate needs medical attention. I'm prepared to allow you to collect your wounded and depart, but only if you leave immediately and never return to this valley." The offer represented magnanimous terms that acknowledged Morrison's serious condition while providing Crenshaw with a face-saving alternative to continued combat. Clara's Blackfoot training had emphasized that honorable enemies deserved opportunities to withdraw when defeat became inevitable, though such mercy was contingent on their willingness to accept reasonable terms. Crenshaw's pride struggled against practical reality as he assessed his remaining options. His horse was dead, one associate was seriously wounded, and his third partner had effectively abandoned the operation. Continuing the fight would require facing Clara alone while somehow protecting Morrison, whose condition appeared to be worsening rapidly. "What guarantee do I have that you won't shoot us while we're trying to help Jake?" Crenshaw demanded, his question revealing both tactical caution and grudging recognition of Clara's demonstrated accuracy with traditional weapons. "You have my word," Clara replied simply, the statement carrying weight that surprised Crenshaw with its directness and apparent sincerity. "I have no desire to kill anyone who isn't actively threatening my property or safety. Help your friend and leave peacefully, and this confrontation ends here." The promise reflected principles that Red Thunder had taught her about honorable warfare. Enemies who acknowledged defeat deserved opportunities to preserve their lives and dignity, provided they accepted reasonable terms for surrender. Clara's adoption into Blackfoot culture had included comprehensive education in both military tactics and the ethical framework that governed their application. Morrison's increasingly labored breathing from the rear of the cabin emphasized the urgency of Crenshaw's decision. The gang leader's wounded associate needed immediate medical attention that could only be provided by retreating to the nearest town with a doctor. Continuing their assault would likely result in Morrison's death, even if they somehow managed to overcome Clara's defenses. "All right," Crenshaw finally conceded, his voice heavy with the bitter taste of defeat. "But this isn't over, lady. Word's going to spread about what happened here, and not everyone who hears it will be as willing to walk away as I am." The threat was hollow, and both participants knew it. Crenshaw's reputation had been damaged by failing to overcome a single woman despite significant numerical and apparent tactical advantages. Criminal networks valued success and competence above all else, making his current situation a liability rather than an asset for future operations. Clara watched as Crenshaw emerged from cover and moved carefully toward the rear of the cabin, where Morrison waited. The gang leader's movements were cautious but not hostile, suggesting genuine acceptance of her terms despite his verbal defiance. His primary concern had shifted from continuing the assault to preserving his remaining associates and salvaging whatever dignity the situation might permit. "Jake, we're getting out of here," Crenshaw announced as he reached Morrison's position. "Can you ride if I help you get mounted?" Morrison's response was weak but affirmative. The arrow wound had cost him significant blood and mobility, but adrenaline and desperation might provide enough strength for the journey to medical care. His survival depended on reaching professional treatment within hours, rather than continuing a fight he could no longer participate in effectively. Berkshire had successfully reached Morrison's horse and was leading it toward the rear of the cabin, his relief at escaping combat evident in his improved posture and steadier movements. The young man's decision to abandon the operation had probably saved his life, though his reputation among criminal associates would suffer permanent damage from his perceived cowardice. Clara remained visible on her front porch as the three men struggled to get Morrison mounted and positioned for travel. Her continued presence with weapons ready served as a reminder that she could resume hostilities instantly if they attempted treachery, while her restraint demonstrated the genuine nature of her offer for peaceful withdrawal. The process of mounting Morrison required several minutes, during which Crenshaw and Berkshire had to support their wounded companion, while managing a nervous horse that could smell blood and sense the tension among its handlers. Morrison's face had gone pale, and his coordination was clearly impaired by blood loss, but he managed to maintain his seat once properly positioned. "Remember what I said about this not being over," Crenshaw called out as the three men prepared to depart, though his words carried more desperation than conviction. "There are men in these territories who won't be as understanding about resistance as I've been. Clara's response was delivered with quiet confidence that reflected both her Blackfoot training and her thorough understanding of frontier criminal networks. "Mr. Crenshaw, I suggest you warn those men that this homestead is protected by capabilities they won't anticipate. Any future visitors with criminal intentions will receive far less mercy than I've shown you today." The statement carried implications that Crenshaw was only beginning to comprehend. Clara's demonstration of traditional warfare skills suggested connections to Native American communities that could provide resources and support far beyond what isolated homesteaders typically possessed. Her restraint in not killing his associates, when she clearly possessed the ability to do so, indicated both tactical sophistication and cultural influences that most white settlers never acquired. As the three men began their painful journey toward the valley's main trail, Clara remained on her porch until they disappeared from view. Only then did she lower her weapons and allow herself to fully process what had just occurred. The confrontation had tested skills she hoped never to use in her new life as a settler's wife, but the results had vindicated Red Thunder's insistence that warrior training remained valuable even in supposedly civilized circumstances. The horses in her corral had remained relatively calm throughout the fighting, though their alert posture indicated awareness that danger had recently threatened their domain. The two Appaloosas that had originally attracted the gang's attention whinnied softly as Clara approached, recognizing her familiar scent and presence as signals that normal routine could resume. Examining Crenshaw's dead horse, Clara felt genuine regret about the necessity of killing the animal. Blackfoot culture emphasized respect for all life, particularly animals whose death served human purposes. The horse had been innocent of its owner's criminal intentions, but eliminating it had been necessary to prevent escape and potential return with reinforcements. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Clara cleaned and stored her traditional weapons while reflecting on lessons learned during the morning's confrontation. The skills Red Thunder and Spotted Eagle Woman had taught her remained sharp despite years of disuse, confirming their repeated warnings that warrior abilities must be maintained even during peaceful times. Most importantly, the encounter demonstrated that her carefully constructed identity as a typical frontier wife provided perfect camouflage for capabilities that few enemies would anticipate or prepare for. Future threats might be deterred by stories about the woman in Clearwater Valley who fought with weapons and skills that belonged to a different world entirely. The peaceful homestead had successfully defended itself against professional criminals. But Clara understood that this victory was only the beginning of challenges that her dual identity might bring. Word would spread about what had occurred, potentially attracting both threats and allies who recognized the significance of a white woman trained in traditional Native American warfare. The departure of Crenshaw's battered gang should have marked the end of Clara's troubles, but her years with the Blackfoot had taught her that wounded predators often returned with reinforcements when their pride demanded revenge. As she watched the three men disappear over the eastern ridge, their painful progress obvious even at distance, Clara knew this confrontation represented only the first chapter of a larger conflict that would test every skill Red Thunder had taught her. 3 hours after the gang's retreat, Clara detected the subtle signs that confirmed her suspicions. The magpies that normally chattered in the cottonwoods along the creek had fallen silent, their behavior indicating human presence where none should exist. A red-winged blackbird's alarm call from the northern approach suggested movement through areas that legitimate travelers wouldn't normally traverse. Most tellingly, her horses displayed the restless behavior that indicated unfamiliar scents carried on shifting wind currents. Standing on her porch with a cup of coffee that served as cover for surveillance activities, Clara systematically scanned the surrounding terrain while appearing to enjoy the late afternoon sunshine. Her trained eye caught fleeting glimpses of movement among the pine trees that crowned the ridgeline. Multiple figures positioned to observe her homestead while remaining concealed from casual observation. Crenshaw had clearly sent word to associates who possessed different capabilities than his original gang. These new watchers moved with greater skill and discipline, suggesting military experience or specialized training in reconnaissance operations. Their patient observation from concealed positions indicated tactical sophistication that exceeded the crude intimidation methods Crenshaw's group had employed. Clara counted at least 4 distinct observation posts based on reflected sunlight from optical equipment and brief glimpses of human silhouettes against the skyline. The positioning suggested a coordinated surveillance operation designed to gather detailed intelligence about her defenses and daily routines before implementing whatever action they had planned. Moving inside the cabin with casual movements that concealed her growing alertness, Clara activated defensive preparations that went far beyond the weapons she had revealed during the morning's confrontation. Hidden beneath her kitchen table lay items that connected her not just to Blackfoot warrior traditions but to specific skills that few members of the tribe had ever mastered. The leather pouch she retrieved contained materials for creating traditional smoke signals, a communication method that could summon assistance from allies whose existence Crenshaw's associates couldn't possibly suspect. During her years with the Siksika Nation, Clara had formed bonds that transcended her eventual return to white society. Warriors who had fought beside her during conflicts with rival tribes remained loyal to someone they considered a true sister. Regardless of her current residence among settlers, Red Thunder had insisted that Clara learn the precise techniques for requesting aid through smoke signals, emphasizing that warrior skills included knowing when individual courage must yield to tactical wisdom. The signal she now prepared would travel across valleys and ridgelines to reach eyes trained to interpret their meaning, eyes belonging to Blackfoot warriors who had promised assistance if their adopted sister ever faced threats beyond her individual capabilities. Building the signal fire required careful attention to materials and timing. The smoke needed to rise during late afternoon when atmospheric conditions would carry it maximum distance while remaining visible against the azure sky. More importantly, the specific pattern of smoke puffs would convey precise information about the nature of her situation and the type of assistance required. As Clara gathered the necessary kindling and positioned it on the elevated platform she had constructed for this purpose, movement in her peripheral vision confirmed that the watchers had noticed her activity. Several of the observation posts showed increased activity as their occupants attempted to determine the significance of her fire-building preparations. The first column of smoke rose straight and true in the still air, its white trail clearly visible against the darkening eastern sky. Clara used a blanket to interrupt the smoke flow in specific intervals, creating the pattern that would identify her location and communicate her need for warrior assistance. 3 long puffs followed by 2 short ones, repeated 3 times. The signal Red Thunder had taught her meant, adopted daughter requests aid against multiple enemies. The response came faster than Clara had dared hope. From the northwestern peaks that marked traditional Blackfoot hunting grounds, an answering column of smoke appeared within minutes of her signal. The reply pattern confirmed that her message had been received and understood. 4 long puffs indicating warriors coming. Maintain position until darkness. The exchange of signals lasted only minutes, but its implications would reshape the tactical situation entirely. Clara's watchers had observed her communication with unknown allies, though they almost certainly lacked the cultural knowledge to interpret traditional Native American smoke signal techniques. Their reconnaissance mission had revealed that their target possessed resources and connections far beyond those available to isolated frontier settlers. As evening approached, Clara made methodical preparations for a type of warfare that few white criminals had ever encountered. The traditional tactics she had learned during raids against Crow encampments and defensive actions against cavalry patrols required equipment and mindset completely different from conventional frontier fighting. The war paint she applied using pigments stored in sealed containers beneath her floorboards served both spiritual and practical purposes. The patterns Red Thunder had taught her would make her face difficult to recognize in darkness while carrying symbolic meaning that honored the spirits of Blackfoot ancestors who guided warriors in combat. The ritual preparation helped focus her mind on the deadly tasks ahead while connecting her to cultural traditions that gave meaning to violence. Her clothing transformation was equally thorough. The settler's dress and sunbonnet that had served as camouflage during the morning's deception were replaced by buckskin leggings and a fringed shirt that allowed silent movement through dense vegetation. Soft-soled moccasins replaced her conventional boots, providing the foot sensation necessary for navigating rough terrain without creating sounds that might alert enemies to her approach. The weapons Clara assembled represented a complete arsenal of traditional Blackfoot warfare implements. In addition to her bow and war hatchet, she retrieved a skinning knife sharp enough to cut throat cartilage with a single stroke, a war club weighted with iron and designed for crushing skulls, and a supply of specialized arrows whose points had been dipped in plant extracts that would cause rapid blood poisoning if they failed to kill immediately. Most significantly, Clara prepared items that would have horrified her morning visitors had they understood their purpose. Small clay pots contained materials for creating firebombs that could destroy wooden structures or create diversionary blazes. Braided sinew formed snares capable of silently eliminating sentries who wandered too far from their posts. A collection of sharp stones had been shaped for throwing with accuracy that could disable enemies at ranges where conventional weapons proved ineffective. As full darkness settled over Clearwater Valley, the tactical advantage shifted decisively toward defenders who possessed skills in nighttime combat operations. Clara's years of hunting nocturnal game with Blackfoot warriors had developed her ability to move silently through terrain that would challenge even experienced woodsmen. More importantly, she understood how to use darkness itself as a weapon against enemies who lacked specialized training in forest warfare. The Watchers' campfire on the eastern ridge provided a beacon that revealed their exact position while destroying their night vision adaptation. Clara could see at least 3 figures silhouetted against the flames, their casual posture suggesting confidence in their concealed position and numerical advantage. What they couldn't know was that their fire made them visible to eyes trained in traditional hunting techniques, while illuminating nothing of the surrounding darkness where their enemies might approach. Clara's movement toward the eastern ridge represented a masterpiece of stealth learned during countless hunting expeditions where silence meant the difference between successful kills and empty-handed returns. Each footstep was placed with conscious attention to ground conditions that might create betraying sounds. Her breathing followed patterns that minimized noise, while maintaining the oxygen supply necessary for sustained physical effort. The traditional Blackfoot approach to night combat emphasized patience and psychological warfare over direct assault. Clara's first objective was gathering intelligence about her enemies' capabilities and intentions while remaining completely undetected. Only after establishing tactical advantages would she consider direct action against opponents whose numbers remained unclear. Reaching a position within 50 yards of the Watchers' campfire required nearly an hour of careful movement through undergrowth and scattered deadfall. Clara's vantage point behind a massive pine trunk provided clear observation of the enemy camp while offering multiple escape routes if her presence was discovered. What she saw confirmed her suspicions about the increased sophistication of this second wave of threats. 5 men occupied the camp, all displaying equipment and bearing that suggested professional military or paramilitary experience. Their weapons were well maintained and positioned for immediate access, while their perimeter security included tripwires and noisemakers that would alert them to conventional approaches. Most concerning was the presence of a man who appeared to be studying detailed maps of the valley while making notations that suggested systematic planning for complex operations. The conversation Clara overheard revealed information that transformed her understanding of the threat these men represented. They weren't simply reinforcements sent to avenge Crenshaw's humiliation. They were advance scouts for a larger organization with interests that extended far beyond horse theft. Targets got connections we didn't anticipate, the apparent leader was saying, his voice carrying the clipped precision of someone accustomed to giving military orders. Those smoke signals went to somebody who knew how to respond fast. We're looking at potential tribal involvement in what should have been a simple operation. Another voice responded with obvious concern about complications beyond their original mission parameters. Boss said this was supposed to be straightforward intimidation followed by property acquisition. Nobody mentioned the possibility of fighting. Actual Indians alongside some crazy woman who shoots arrows like she grew up with them. The exchange confirmed Clara's assessment that her morning's defensive actions had attracted attention from criminal organizations with resources and capabilities far exceeding Crenshaw's amateur gang. More disturbing was their casual reference to property acquisition, suggesting that horse theft had been merely the opening move in a larger scheme targeting her homestead for reasons that remained unclear. A third voice contributed information that made Clara's blood run cold with its implications for her long-term security. Railway survey teams have been through this valley twice in the past month. Word is the territorial government's considering a spur line to connect the mining camps with the main transcontinental route. Property values could increase tenfold if those plans go through. The revelation explained motivations that had nothing to do with livestock theft. Clara's homestead occupied a strategic position that would become extremely valuable if railroad development proceeded as planned. Criminal organizations were apparently moving to acquire properties along the proposed route, using intimidation and violence to force out current owners before land values reflected their true worth. Clara's tactical situation had just become far more complex and dangerous than she had initially realized. These weren't temporary threats that could be resolved through demonstrations of defensive capability. They represented the advance elements of systematic campaigns designed to clear the valley of existing residents, regardless of their willingness or ability to resist. The sound of approaching horses from the valley floor interrupted Clara's intelligence gathering as riders moved through darkness toward the Watcher's position. The reinforcements arrived as organized units rather than individual fighters, their disciplined approach confirming the military character of the organization she now faced. Counting the new arrivals required careful observation as they moved. Between the campfire and surrounding darkness, Clara identified at least 8 additional men, bringing the total enemy force to 13 fighters with equipment and training that suggested serious combat capabilities. Most carried rifles with telescopic sights designed for long-range precision shooting, while several displayed specialized gear that indicated expertise in siege warfare or demolitions. The leader's briefing to the new arrivals provided crucial intelligence about their intentions and timeline. Primary objective remains property acquisition through elimination of current occupants. Secondary considerations include recovering reputation damaged by this morning's operational failure. We've got 48 hours before territorial authorities potentially respond to reports of missing persons. Clara absorbed this information with growing certainty that her situation had evolved beyond anything conventional defensive measures could address. 13 trained fighters with sophisticated equipment represented overwhelming odds even for someone with her specialized skills. More critically, their obvious intention to eliminate rather than simply intimidate meant that negotiated solutions were no longer possible. The distant sound that reached Clara's ears represented salvation arriving exactly when circumstances had become most desperate. Blackfoot warriors moved through darkness with silence that made her own stealth techniques seem crude by comparison. but she recognized the subtle indicators of their approach, a pattern of bird calls that didn't quite match natural behavior, the whisper of moccasined feet on pine needles, and most distinctively, the faint scent of traditional war paint carried on night air. Red Thunder himself emerged from the shadows beside Clara's position, his presence so sudden and silent that even her trained senses hadn't detected his approach until he chose to reveal himself. The aging war chief's face bore paint patterns that proclaimed his status as a leader of men in battle, while his weapons gleamed with the deadly efficiency of tools maintained by someone who understood their importance for survival. "Sister," Red Thunder whispered in the Blackfoot language that Clara had learned to speak as fluently as English, "we saw your smoke signal and came with 12 warriors. Are you ready to show these white men what happens when they threaten the Khoisan family of the Siksika nation?" Clara's response carried gratitude mixed with the cold satisfaction of knowing that the tactical balance had shifted decisively in her favor. "Father, these men plan to kill me and steal my land for the railroad companies. They have brought 13 fighters with military weapons, believing one woman could not resist their numbers." Red Thunder's smile in the darkness held promise of violence that would satisfy both justice and revenge for threats against someone the tribe considered family. "Then they will learn that Blackfoot warriors protect their own with methods these white criminals have never encountered. Tonight we will teach them why our enemies fear entering Siksika territory." The counterstrike was about to begin, and Clara Whitfield's hidden past was finally ready to emerge with full deadly force. The Blackfoot warriors spread through the darkness like vengeful spirits, their movements so silent that even Clara's enhanced hearing could barely detect their positioning around the enemy encampment. Red Thunder's tactical deployment demonstrated the sophisticated military thinking that had made the Siksika nation feared across the northern plains for generations. Each warrior took positions that maximized their traditional weapons' effectiveness, while minimizing exposure to the enemy's superior firepower. Clara watched with professional admiration as the warriors implemented coordinated strategies she had witnessed during raids against Crow war parties and cavalry units. Unlike the improvised response she had mounted against Crenshaw's gang, this operation proceeded with the methodical precision of experienced fighters who had perfected their techniques through decades of warfare against technologically superior enemies. Standing there, Red Thunder's most trusted lieutenant had positioned himself with 2 other warriors to control the trail that led down from the ridge toward Clara's homestead. Their assignment was preventing escape or retreat by the criminal organization while ensuring that no additional reinforcements could reach the main camp. The war party's traditional tactic of complete encirclement would trap their enemies in terrain chosen by Blackfoot fighters rather than allowing them to dictate engagement conditions. Gray Wolf and his partner Silent Fox had taken positions that would allow them to target the sentries posted around the camp's perimeter. These guards represented the criminal organization's early warning system, and their elimination would blind the main force to threats approaching from directions they couldn't monitor. The Blackfoot understanding of psychological warfare emphasized that enemies fighting without information became prey rather than predators. Most critically, Running Elk and 2 of the youngest warriors had been assigned to capture or eliminate any enemies who attempted to flee toward the main trail leading out of the valley. Red Thunder's experience had taught him that survivors who escaped carried information about Blackfoot involvement that could bring cavalry retaliation against tribal territories. This operation required either complete victory or total elimination of witnesses who might identify the participants. Clara's role in the attack reflected both her unique position as the primary target and her specialized knowledge of the enemy's capabilities and positioning. Her reconnaissance had provided crucial intelligence about their weapons, numbers, and defensive preparations, while her cultural fluency in both White and Blackfoot military traditions made her the ideal coordinator between Red Thunder's tactical decisions, and the practical requirements of nighttime assault. "Sister," Red Thunder whispered as the final positioning of warriors neared completion, "when we attack, you must reach the cabin safely while we deal with these men. If any escape, they will return with soldiers who care nothing for the justice of our cause." Clara understood the implications beneath his directive. Blackfoot involvement in violence against white civilians would trigger massive military response, regardless of the criminal's original intentions or actions. Her survival and ability to present the official version of events might be the only thing preventing catastrophic retaliation against innocent tribal members who had simply honored their obligations to protect an adopted sister. "Father, I will not hide while my brothers risk their lives defending my home," Clara replied in fluent Blackfoot, her voice carrying the stubborn courage that had first earned Red Thunder's respect during her adolescent years with the tribe. These men came to steal and kill. They should face the consequences of their choices with full understanding of who they threatened. Red Thunder's weathered features showed brief amusement at Clara's defiance, recognizing the warrior spirit that had made her adoption into the tribe genuine rather than merely ceremonial. "Then stay close and follow my lead. Tonight you fight as a Siksika warrior, not as white woman playing at being a settler's wife." The transformation in Clara's mindset was immediate and profound. The careful balance she had maintained between her adopted identity and her birth culture dissolved completely, replaced by the focused clarity she had experienced during actual combat alongside Blackfoot war parties. Her breathing deepened into the controlled rhythm that maximized oxygen flow during sustained physical exertion, while her awareness expanded to encompass every detail of terrain, wind direction, and potential escape routes. The first phase of the attack began with absolute silence as Grey Wolf eliminated the northern sentry with a technique that left no sound to alert his companions. The warrior's approach had been so perfectly executed that the guards simply collapsed without understanding what had killed him, his throat opened by a blade wielded with surgical precision. The body was carefully positioned to appear as though the man had simply fallen asleep at his post. Silent Fox's elimination of the eastern sentry proceeded with equal efficiency, though his method involved a strangling cord that cut off airflow before the victim could cry out. The Blackfoot understanding of anatomy included precise knowledge of pressure points and blood vessels that could render enemies unconscious or dead within seconds when properly exploited. With the perimeter guards neutralized, the main assault could proceed without risk of early warning reaching the criminal organization's leadership. Red Thunder's hand signal initiated coordinated movement by all remaining warriors toward positions that would allow simultaneous attacks from multiple directions, overwhelming the enemy's ability to mount effective resistance. Clara accompanied Red Thunder's direct approach toward the campfire where the organization's leaders continued their planning session, apparently unaware that their security had been completely compromised. The arrogance these men displayed in maintaining their illuminated position while discussing criminal activities demonstrated they contempt for local resistance that would prove their fatal mistake. The attack erupted with shocking suddenness as arrows began striking targets with deadly accuracy from directions the criminals hadn't anticipated or prepared for. The Blackfoot warriors' opening volley was designed to eliminate key personnel while creating maximum confusion among survivors who suddenly found themselves fighting enemies they couldn't see or effectively counter. The organization's leader collapsed with Red Thunder's arrow protruding from his chest, the steel point having punched through his ribs to pierce his heart with precision that killed him instantly. His detailed maps of the valley scattered across the ground as his body convulsed briefly before becoming still, their contents now irrelevant to plans that would never be implemented. 2 other men fell in the opening seconds as standing bears. Warriors demonstrated the lethal effectiveness of traditional weapons wielded by experts who had spent lifetimes perfecting their accuracy. The arrows struck with force sufficient to penetrate thick clothing, and drive deep into vital organs, causing immediate incapacitation that prevented return fire or organized resistance. The surviving criminals attempted to respond with their superior firepower, but their rifle shots scattered wildly into darkness that concealed targets moving with skills learned through generations of warfare. The muzzle flashes from their weapons served only to reveal their positions to enemies who could shoot accurately without betraying their own locations. Clara's participation in the assault reflected training that transcended anything civilian settlers typically possessed. Her war hatchet found its target in the skull of a man attempting to organize defensive resistance, the weighted steel head-crushing bone with impact that dropped him instantly to the ground. The specialized throwing technique Red Thunder had taught her delivered the weapon with rotational force that maximized penetration while maintaining accuracy across distances that few warriors ever achieved. A criminal who attempted to flee toward the main trail discovered that Blackfoot tactical planning had anticipated every possible escape route. Running Elk's lance punched through his back to emerge from his chest, the traditional weapon wielded with enough force to lift him off his feet before gravity returned him to earth as a corpse that would threaten no one again. The engagement's duration was measured in minutes rather than hours, demonstrating the devastating effectiveness of coordinated assault by fighters who understood both traditional tactics and their enemies' technological limitations. Rifle superiority meant nothing when targets remained invisible while arrows struck with lethal accuracy from concealed positions. Clara found herself engaged in hand-to-hand combat with a bearded giant who had survived the initial volley and attempted to reach cover behind scattered equipment boxes. His size and obvious strength represented advantages that could prove decisive in close-quarters fighting. But Clara's Blackfoot training had emphasized techniques for defeating larger opponents through speed and precision rather than matching their raw power. The skinning knife in her hand moved with surgical accuracy toward pressure points that would disable or kill regardless of her opponent's physical advantages. Her first strike opened the major artery in his left wrist, causing immediate blood loss that would weaken him rapidly even if the wound itself wasn't immediately fatal. His attempt to grapple with her failed as Clara employed leverage techniques that used his own momentum against him, sending the massive man tumbling over her hip to crash against the scattered remains of their campfire. The impact scattered burning coals across his clothing while positioning him for the finishing stroke that opened his throat with clinical efficiency. The systematic elimination of the criminal organization proceeded with ruthless efficiency as Blackfoot warriors demonstrated capabilities that few white adversaries had ever encountered and survived to describe. Traditional weapons wielded by experts proved devastatingly effective against enemies who had prepared only for conventional frontier resistance. Within minutes, the ridge that had hosted 13 armed criminals planning systematic land acquisition through murder and intimidation became a silent battlefield littered with bodies that would never threaten anyone again. The Blackfoot approach to warfare emphasized complete victory rather than partial success, ensuring that defeated enemies couldn't regroup for future attacks. Red Thunder's post-battle assessment revealed the thoroughness of their tactical success. All 13 criminals lay dead, their sophisticated equipment scattered uselessly around a campsite that had become their tomb. No survivors remained to carry word about Blackfoot involvement to authorities who might seek retaliation against innocent tribal members. "It is finished," Red Thunder announced with satisfaction that reflected both successful completion of the mission and justice achieved for threats against someone the tribe considered family. These men learned what happens when wolves threaten the children of the Siksika Nation. Clara's examination of the scattered documents and equipment revealed information that confirmed her suspicions about the scope of the conspiracy they had just defeated. Maps marked properties throughout Clearwater Valley, while written correspondence detailed systematic plans for forcing out existing residents to clear the way for railroad Development and associated commercial exploitation. The criminal organization had represented advanced elements of a larger scheme involving corrupt territorial officials, railway companies, and hired mercenaries who specialized in removing obstacles to profitable development projects. Clara's successful resistance to their initial approaches had escalated their response from simple intimidation to systematic elimination, triggering the counterattack that had ultimately destroyed their entire operation. Most significantly, the documents revealed that Clara's homestead was merely one target among dozens of properties marked for acquisition through whatever means proved necessary. The peaceful valley that had provided refuge for both her settler identity and her Blackfoot connections had been identified as a strategic corridor, worth millions of dollars to developers who cared nothing about existing residents or their rights. "Father, this is bigger than just threats against my land," Clara explained as she showed Red Thunder the incriminating evidence they had recovered. These men were part of organized efforts to steal the entire valley from everyone who lives here. Our victory tonight may have saved many families from suffering similar attacks. Red Thunder studied the documents with interest that reflected both his strategic intelligence and his understanding of white business practices that had threatened tribal territories throughout his lifetime. "Then justice has been served for crimes not yet committed, as well as those already attempted. The spirits of our ancestors smile on warriors who protect the innocent from those who would steal their homes. The disposal of evidence and bodies required careful attention to methods that would prevent discovery by authorities who might investigate the mercenaries' disappearance. Blackfoot traditions included techniques for ensuring that defeated enemies left no traces that could connect their deaths to specific warriors or tribal involvement. Bear and his companions systematically destroyed all equipment and documentation that might link the criminal organization to their employers or reveal the scope of their intended operations. Weapons were gathered for potential future use, while personal effects were scattered in ways that suggested robbery by multiple assailants rather than coordinated military action. The bodies themselves were carried to locations where natural processes would eliminate evidence of the specific wounds that had killed them. Deep ravines and hidden caves throughout the valley would conceal remains until decomposition made identification impossible, ensuring that no physical evidence could contradict whatever official explanation authorities might eventually develop. Clara's participation in this cleanup operation reflected her complete integration into Blackfoot culture despite her birth identity as a white woman. The warriors treated her as an equal partner in activities that required both physical strength and cultural understanding of methods for avoiding detection by hostile authorities. As dawn approached, the ridge showed no signs that 13 armed men had ever occupied it or died there. The Blackfoot understanding of warfare included comprehensive knowledge of how to erase traces of military action, skills developed through centuries of conflict with enemies who possessed superior numbers and resources. Red Thunder's parting instructions to Clara emphasized the importance of maintaining her settler identity while remaining prepared for future threats that might emerge from the conspiracy they had disrupted. "Sister, you have shown these criminals that some prey is more dangerous than predators expect. But their employers will eventually wonder why their men never returned. Be ready for others who may come seeking answers." Clara understood that her victory had been complete, but probably not final. Criminal organizations with the resources to hire professional mercenaries rarely accepted defeat without attempting to understand what had gone wrong. Future investigators might prove more cautious and better prepared than the fighters who had underestimated both her capabilities and her connections to allies they never anticipated. The transformation back to her settler identity would require careful attention to details that might betray her involvement in the night's violent events. War paint had to be completely removed, traditional weapons returned to concealment, and any evidence of recent combat eliminated from her appearance and clothing. As Red Thunder and his warriors melted back into the darkness that had concealed their approach. Clara made her way down the ridge toward her cabin, with satisfaction that justice had been served and her home secured. The peaceful homestead awaited her return, its familiar outlines unchanged despite the violence that had raged in the surrounding hills. The dawn that was breaking over Clearwater Valley would reveal nothing of the night's events to casual observers. But Clara knew that word would eventually spread about what happened when criminals threatened the wrong woman in the wrong territory. The story would serve as warning to future predators that some prey possessed teeth sharp enough to prove fatal to those who underestimated them. 3 weeks after the night that had transformed Clearwater Valley from a peaceful frontier settlement into the site of the most decisive victory in recent Blackfoot military history, Clara stood on her porch watching the approach of a familiar figure that brought both relief and new challenges. Samuel Whitfield guided his heavily loaded pack mule up the winding trail toward their homestead, his return from the Helena mining camps marking the end of his longest absence since their marriage. Clara's appearance had returned to the carefully maintained image of a frontier wife, those subtle changes in her posture and bearing reflected experiences that would forever alter her relationship with the settler identity she had chosen to embrace. The calico dress and sunbonnet concealed muscles that bore new scars from recent combat, while her eyes held depths that spoke of violence witnessed and justice delivered through methods her husband would struggle to comprehend. Samuel's greeting carried the familiar warmth of a man eager to reunite with a beloved wife, though his trained eye immediately detected signs that something significant had occurred during his absence. The positioning of equipment around the cabin showed evidence of recent defensive preparations, while Clara's movements displayed heightened alertness that suggested recent exposure to serious threats. "Clara, my darling," Samuel called out as he dismounted near the cabin's front porch, his weathered face showing both joy at their reunion and concern about the subtle changes he was already observing. "I've missed you terribly, though it looks like you've been keeping yourself busy while I was working on the claims." Clara's embrace was genuine but brief, her attention already shifting to the practical necessities of Samuel's return and the complex explanations his presence would require. The documents hidden beneath their floorboards contained evidence of conspiracies that extended far beyond their individual property, while the complete elimination of the criminal organization had created mysteries that territorial authorities were only beginning to investigate. "Samuel, we need to talk about some things that happened while you were away," Clara said quietly, her tone carrying seriousness that immediately focused her husband's attention. There were visitors who had intentions that went far beyond anything we've dealt with before. Samuel's expression darkened as he recognized the implications of Clara's careful phrasing. His wife's background with the Blackfoot had prepared him for the possibility that her past might eventually create complications in their civilian life, though he had hoped such confrontations could be avoided through their remote location and careful discretion about Clara's capabilities. "How serious were these visitors, and how did you handle the situation?" Samuel asked, his own military experience providing context for evaluating threats that might require responses beyond conventional frontier self-defense. Clara's account of recent events was carefully edited to emphasize the criminal organization's intentions, while minimizing details about the methods used to eliminate them. Samuel's loyalty to his wife was absolute, but his position as a law-abiding settler required maintaining some distance from activities that might be considered vigilante justice by territorial authorities. Horse thieves came first, led by a man named Crenshaw, Clara explained, leading Samuel inside, where their conversation would be private from any potential observers. "When I successfully resisted their initial attempts, they brought reinforcements with military equipment and specific plans to eliminate me and claim our property for railroad development." Samuel absorbed this information with growing concern. That reflected both personal fears for his wife's safety and professional understanding of the broader implications. Railroad expansion represented powerful commercial interests with resources to overwhelm individual resistance, while Clara's successful opposition suggested escalation that could attract unwanted attention from multiple directions. How many men were involved, and what evidence do we have of their intentions? Samuel asked, his questions revealing the practical mindset that had made him a successful prospector despite the dangerous nature of frontier mining operations. Clara retrieved the documents she had preserved from the criminal organization's possessions, spreading maps and correspondence across their kitchen table to demonstrate the scope of the conspiracy. Samuel's absence had prevented him from witnessing. The evidence painted a disturbing picture of systematic land acquisition through intimidation and violence that threatened every property owner in Clearwater Valley. Samuel, they had detailed plans for forcing out every family between here and the main territorial road, Clara explained, pointing to marked locations that represented dozens of homesteads targeted for acquisition. Our place was just one piece of a scheme that would have displaced hundreds of people to clear the way for railway construction. Samuel's examination of the documentation revealed both the sophistication of the criminal enterprise and the complete absence of any surviving perpetrators who might testify about their origins or methods. The papers contained enough evidence to implicate territorial officials and railway executives in systematic corruption, though the fate of the men who had carried them remained carefully unexplained. Clara, these documents represent evidence of criminal conspiracy that could result in prosecutions reaching the highest levels of territorial government, Samuel observed, his legal knowledge highlighting implications that extended far beyond their personal security. But I notice you haven't mentioned what happened to the men who were carrying them. Clara's response was carefully measured to acknowledge Samuel's need for honesty, while protecting him from knowledge that might compromise his ability to interact with law enforcement officials who would inevitably investigate the mercenaries' disappearance. The men who threatened our home discovered that their assessment of the situation was fundamentally flawed, Clara replied, her phrasing carrying enough ambiguity to satisfy Samuel's immediate questions without providing details that might burden his conscience. They will not be returning to trouble us or anyone else in this valley. Samuel's military experience provided sufficient context to understand the implications of Clara's statement without requiring explicit confirmation of methods that might not withstand legal scrutiny. His wife's capabilities had been demonstrated during their courtship, and he had married her with full awareness that her Blackfoot training included skills that conventional settlers rarely possessed. The arrival of territorial authorities 3 days later provided the first test of the story Clara and Samuel had prepared to explain recent events in Clearwater Valley. Deputy Marshal Harrison arrived with a small investigative team tasked with determining the fate of 13 men who had disappeared while conducting what their employers described as legitimate business activities. Clara's interaction with the marshal demonstrated the effectiveness of her settler identity in deflecting official suspicion from activities that might complicate territorial relations with nearby Blackfoot communities. Her appearance and demeanor suggested a frontier wife, concerned about security rather than someone capable of eliminating professional criminals through methods they never anticipated. Mrs. Whitfield, we're investigating the disappearance of some men who may have passed through this area recently, Marshal Harrison explained, his professional courtesy masking obvious skepticism about the explanations he had received from the missing men's employers. Did you encounter any strangers who might have been conducting business related to railroad surveying or land acquisition? Clara's response was truthful within the limitations necessary to protect both her own security and the Blackfoot warriors who had risked their lives defending her property. Marshal, we had visits from men who claimed to be interested in purchasing our horses, though their behavior suggested intentions that went beyond legitimate business transactions. The marshal's follow-up questions revealed his awareness that the missing men had been involved in activities that their employers preferred not to discuss in detail. His investigation was proceeding under constraints that suggested powerful interests were more concerned with preventing embarrassing revelations than with achieving justice for disappeared subordinates. Did these men make any threats against you or your property, and if so, how did you respond to such threats? Harrison asked, his phrasing indicating familiarity with frontier situations where self-defense might justify extreme measures. Samuel's participation in the conversation provided crucial support for Clara's account while maintaining the impression that any defensive actions had been undertaken by conventional means available to isolated homesteaders. His presence as a witness legitimized Clara's story, while his own reputation as a law-abiding citizen deflected suspicion about unconventional methods. "Marshal, my wife successfully defended our property against men who attempted theft through intimidation and force," Samuel stated firmly, his tone carrying conviction that reflected both marital loyalty and genuine belief in Clara's capabilities. "I'm proud of her courage in facing threats that would have overwhelmed many people in similar circumstances." The marshal's inspection of the homestead revealed evidence of recent defensive preparations, but nothing that suggested the scale of violence that had actually occurred on the surrounding ridges. Clara's careful cleanup had eliminated all traces of the battle that had decided the criminal organization's fate, while the disposal of bodies and equipment had been so thorough that no physical evidence remained to contradict her explanation. Most importantly, the investigation failed to discover any connection between Clara's successful defense and the Blackfoot warriors whose intervention had ensured decisive victory over superior numbers. The traditional methods used to eliminate evidence had proven completely effective against law enforcement techniques that relied on physical traces rather than cultural knowledge of Native American military practices. Marshal Harrison's departure, after 3 days of investigation, marked the end of official interest in events that had permanently altered the balance of power in Clearwater Valley. His report would describe the disappearance of 30 men as unexplained, but probably related to the dangerous nature of their unofficial activities rather than any specific criminal action by local residents. The broader consequences of Clara's victory began manifesting within weeks as word spread through criminal networks about the fate of professional operatives who had attempted to intimidate a seemingly isolated frontier woman. The story that emerged emphasized the complete disappearance of well-armed mercenaries who had possessed every tactical advantage except accurate intelligence about their target's true capabilities. Railroad companies and their criminal associates quietly abandoned plans for forced land acquisition in Clearwater Valley, recognizing that systematic resistance had made their original schemes economically unfeasible. The cost of replacing the eliminated operatives and overcoming organized opposition exceeded the projected profits from railway development, particularly when alternative routes existed that avoided areas where local resistance had proven unexpectedly deadly. Other homesteaders throughout the valley began approaching Clara and Samuel with requests for advice about protecting their properties from similar threats. The couple's successful defense had inspired confidence among neighbors who previously felt helpless against organized criminal pressure backed by corrupt territorial officials. Clara's response to these requests required careful balance between providing useful guidance and concealing the specialized resources that had made her own victory possible. Her recommendations focused on conventional defensive measures that isolated families could implement without requiring the military expertise or cultural connections that had proven decisive in her particular situation. "The most important element is preparation," Clara advised Martha Henderson, whose family had received threatening visits similar to those that had preceded the attack on Clara's homestead. "These men rely on intimidation and surprise to overcome resistance. When targets demonstrate readiness and competence, criminals often seek easier opportunities elsewhere." Samuel's expanding role as an informal leader among Valley residents reflected both his natural diplomatic skills and his unique position as someone who understood the true scope of the threats they had collectively faced. His mining background provided credibility with men who respected practical experience, while his marriage to Clara established connections to defensive capabilities that remained deliberately mysterious. The formation of a valley-wide mutual defense organization represented the most significant long-term consequence of Clara's successful resistance to the criminal conspiracy. Homesteaders who had previously operated as isolated families began coordinating security measures and communication systems that could provide early warning of future threats. Samuel's leadership in establishing these cooperative arrangements emphasized conventional methods that avoided raising questions about unconventional resources that might be available in extreme circumstances. The organizational structure he promoted could function effectively using only legitimate means while remaining adaptable to incorporate additional capabilities if situations demanded escalation beyond normal defensive measures. Clara's participation in training other women represented a particularly important development that reflected both her genuine desire to help neighbors and her strategic understanding of how to strengthen community resistance without revealing specialized skills. The techniques she taught emphasized awareness, preparation, and psychological resilience rather than the lethal combat methods that had proven decisive against professional criminals. Mrs. Patterson, the key is recognizing threats before they become immediate dangers, Clara explained during one of the informal training sessions she conducted for Valley women. Men who approach with criminal intentions often display behavioral patterns that reveal their true purposes before they commit violent action. The knowledge Clara shared was carefully selected to provide genuine protection while maintaining the mystery that surrounded her own exceptional capabilities. Her students learned enough to significantly improve their defensive prospects without gaining insights that might compromise the security provided by connections she preferred to keep secret. Most significantly, Clara's new role as an unofficial community leader allowed her to establish communication networks that could summon assistance from allies whose existence remained unknown to most Valley residents. The system she developed could function as conventional neighbor cooperation, while serving as a foundation for mobilizing more specialized resources if future threats exceeded community defensive capabilities. The seasonal cycle of frontier life resumed its familiar patterns as summer gave way to autumn in Clearwater Valley. Those subtle changes reflected the new reality that had emerged from successful resistance to organized criminal pressure. Families worked their land with confidence that cooperation and preparation could overcome threats that had previously seemed insurmountable. Clara's daily routine maintained the appearance of normal domestic activity while incorporating practices that ensured continued readiness for challenges that might emerge from the broader conspiracy the eliminated mercenaries had represented. Her weapons remained accessible but concealed. Her communication network stayed active but discreet, and her training continued but appeared to observers as simple household management. Samuel's mining activities expanded to include regular visits to territorial administrative centers where his presence served dual purposes, gathering intelligence about political developments that might affect Valley security, while establishing relationships with officials who could provide early warning of renewed threats from criminal organizations or corrupt railway interests. The autumn harvest that concluded the year's agricultural cycle provided an opportunity for the Valley community to celebrate their collective security while acknowledging the uncertain future that railroad expansion might still bring to their region. The cooperative spirit that had emerged from shared resistance to criminal pressure created bonds that strengthened every family's prospects for long-term survival. Clara's reflection on the events that had transformed her from an isolated homesteader into a community leader emphasized the importance of maintaining dual identities that served different purposes in complex situations. Her settler life provided the camouflage necessary for peaceful coexistence with territorial authority, while her Blackfoot connections offered resources that could address threats beyond conventional defensive capabilities. As winter approached, Clearwater Valley, with its promise of temporary isolation from external pressures, Clara stood on her porch watching the first snowflakes begin their descent toward ground that had witnessed violence, justice, and ultimately renewal. The peaceful scene that surrounded her homestead concealed depths of capability and connection that would remain ready to emerge whenever circumstances again demanded that the quiet settler's wife reveal her true nature. The horses that had originally attracted criminal attention grazed contentedly in their secure pasture, their peaceful presence serving as reminder that some things worth protecting required defenders, willing to pay whatever price preservation demanded. Clara Whitfield had proven herself worthy of both identities she carried, and Clearwater Valley was stronger for having witnessed what happened when predators chose to threaten prey that possessed teeth sharp enough to prove fatal to those who underestimated them. The story that would be passed down through generations would speak of the day horse thieves discovered they had robbed the wrong homestead, never knowing that their target was a woman raised by Blackfoot warriors and prepared to defend her chosen home with skills learned in a world where survival demanded the willingness to become more dangerous than any threat that dared to challenge her. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.